Finally, we come to maritime tourism and leisure. So this lecture is going to focus on three things: the great ocean liners of the world, as that concept of, with the transition to gas power, people being able to have personal power boats. And then I'll look at sailboats, so sailing and, of course, yacht racing. So, of course, on this particular slide, the background is of the Titanic, one of the most famous ocean liners that wrecked in 1912. With the conversion from sail power to steam power, crossing an ocean began to be something that could be done on a schedule, instead of at the whims of the weather. So at this point, traveling long distances began to have a lower price tag. In the late 1800s, ocean liners were mainly in the business of delivering immigrants across the Atlantic or the Pacific to American shores. Only a few years later, they began to compete for the business of tourists and travelers, from ordinary families to the nation's wealthiest citizens. So with this shift, in the early 20th century, we see bigger and bigger luxury ocean liners, specifically designed to carry passengers in style. And as advances were made, they really did get larger. Tourism had begun in earnest. So we'll look at Atlantic crossings by some of the famous early ship lines. The United States ship line that started in the 1920s, the infamous Andrea Doria, an Italian ship, and the nuclear ship Savannah. So let's look at these ocean lines. British liners dominated in terms of size at first. So the RMS Oceanic and what's considered the Big Four of the White Star Line were the first ones to be larger than the SS Great Eastern of all the large passenger ships. And ultimately for this, the White Star Line, the owner became an American when it was, the company was bought out by J.P. Morgan. So in order to stem this competition, the British government began contributing financially to the Cunard Line, and they helped by the building of 2 liners. But the government stated that this was only under the condition that the ships, they could be converted to an armed cruiser if that was needed. So the result of this partnership, the government with Cunard Lines, was the completion in 1907 of 2 sister ships, and those were the Lusitania and the Mauretania, both of which had then won the Blue Ribbon. This was during their maiden voyages they won it. The latter ship, the Mauretania, kept that distinction of the Blue Ribbon for 20 years. So part of why these ships were so much faster was that the speed was improved by the use of turbines instead of the conventional expansion machines. So upping the ante against the Cunard lines, the White Star Lines ordered a line of Olympic class ships at the end of 1907. The first of these was the RMS Olympic, completed in 1911, and it had a fine career. However, far more infamous, the sister ship to that one, the RMS Titanic. The ship sank on her maiden voyage, as most of you know, in 1912. It was a horrible tragedy, but because of the impact that had on the mind of the public across the world, there have been some resulting safety regulations that have really been put into law that have kept people far more safer. So how lifes are designed and created, and how many are available, and how people can move between decks, etc., has all been altered because of that wreck. And of course, part of finding out further how and what that wrecking event was the research done by Bob Ballard and the Woods Hole Institute. And I know I've put in a couple of videos online in the module for you, and looking at from seeing these concrete pieces, how big the cracks are in the hull where the iceberg hit. We can find out so much more by looking at it archaeologically underwater later. One of the main American-owned lines started in the 1920s. This was the United States Lines. Eventually became a transatlantic shipping company in the 1960s that operated cargo services. And their most famous ocean liner would have been the SS United States. So the company was formed with 3 ships from the tonnage of a failed U.S. mail steamship company. And 2 of these ships, the America and the George Washington, these were originally German ships that had been captured during the war. And they were taken back to the States and renamed. And then the 3rd ship they had was called the Centennial State. That was their startup. Eventually, in 1923, a couple years later, they purchased the Vaterland, which they renamed as the Leviathan, seen here on the right. So their most famous ship, the SS United States, was the largest at the time at 990 feet. And it was the largest for a long time. That was built in built in 1950 at the cost of almost $80 million, which is $750 million now. And unfortunately, it's, didn't have a very long life, and it's dry docked at a pier in Philadelphia. But it was the longest existing liner until the building of the Queen Mary II, which is 1,132 feet long. So turning closer to New England, one of the most famous wrecks occurred off the island of Nantucket in 1956. This was the sinking of the luxury ocean liner, the Andrea Doria. So in 1956, while it was coming in towards the United States, bound for New York, there was an eastbound ship called the MS Stockholm of the Swedish America Line, and it collided with the Andrea Doria. The Stockholm managed to stay afloat, but because the Andrea Doria was struck in the side and the ship itself was top heavy, it started to lift sideways, and this made like half of the lifeboats unusable. But they managed to get passengers in the remaining lifeboats and ferried to safety. However, this accident, with the loss of 46 people, remains one of it's like the worst maritime disaster that occurred in United States waters since maybe 40 years before that. The accident itself, because it was so close to shore, planes were quickly taken up, and there's coverage in the news media. So the clips that I've added, you can actually see from the planes overhead. So the rescue efforts were amazingly efficient, and so many passengers on the ships were saved. And the blame seems to be on the ship was Italian. This seems to be on the Italian ship. However, more recent discoveries have indicated that perhaps it was a misreading of the radar by the Swedish ship that led to the error that caused them to strike. So from steam-powered ships like the Titanic, technology moved on to huge diesel engines and then to nuclear power. So this picture shows the nuclear ship Savannah. She was launched in 1959. So basically she was built as a merchant ship, but she could carry passengers. So the United States government funded the building of it, and it was meant as a demonstration project for how nuclear power could be used. So there was this fascination with clean energy, and the ship was seen as a way to show how this could be used. So in 1955, the President Eisenhower at that time made this proposal to build a nuclear-powered ship, and they named it the Atoms for Peace initiative. And again, there's a video of it, and you see the passengers on the ship and enjoying, the good life that was supposed to be so modern at the time in the 1950s, and it looks dated now, but it was the pinnacle of technology at the time. So since then, the ship has been deactivated, and it's moored on the docks in Baltimore. So from ocean liners and these grand ships, we move on to small power boats.